Pax Vobiscum, and welcome to this week's conference with. Now, before I get into the meat and the substance of what I'm going to share my thoughts with you about this evening, let me first bring to your attention the possibility of supporting this apostolate and indeed Old Roman TV, and in return gaining something for yourself. We've got some wonderful merch that you can receive if you become a Patreon patron and sponsor of this channel. Now I'm just going to show you now some of the wonderful merchandise that you could own. So you could get this delightful coffee mug with the Old Roman logo on it. This very attractive hoodie, again with the Old Roman logo. And likewise, you could possess your very own Old Roman t-shirt. So the place to go is scrolling along the bottom of the screen, and you can subscribe and support this channel and this apostolate and the programs that we want to produce and develop and improve, from as little as £5 a month, which is about $6.50 a month. But a regular subscription enables us then to be able to pay our own subscriptions for hosting, etc., and also enables us to be able to plan ahead, especially with regards to the development of programs and for purchasing of software and sometimes hardware to enable this apostolate to continue. Okay, so that's the commercial. That's the commercial plug over. Now, thank you, those of you who have commented since last week about last week's episode. I'm glad that so very many of you found it interesting and informative. And I intend this evening to talk a little more along similar lines about the differences between Old Romans and other groups within traditional Catholicism. Now, we discussed quite a bit of the history last week, and so this week I thought perhaps we might touch upon those little things that do distinguish us from each other. And then I want to end by highlighting the similarities between us. So the liturgy really, aside from doctrine, which we covered last week, liturgy too differentiates us. So that those, for example, who are traditional Catholics within the institutional church, they will use the 1962 typical edition of the Roman Missal. This was, as it were, the last version of the Roman Missal before the end of the Second Vatican Council. There was, of course, later a 1965 edition, which incorporated properly, one might suggest, at least what those conciliar fathers had spoken of in Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the document and the discussion about the liturgy in the Second Vatican Council. So that the 1965 edition of the Roman Missal had various parts of the ordinary of the Mass in the vernacular, as well as having various parts in Latin. Now, one of the intriguing things to note perhaps about the 65 edition is that things like the Gloria, the Creed, the Sanctus and Benedictus, all these were still in Latin. And these, of course, were generally the parts that the people would join in with. And rather ironically, the collect, for example, the opening prayer, as it would be later termed in the New Missal, was still recited in Latin, which again might seem rather strange, because one would think, well, surely the collect, and the collector, of course, is so called because it, as it were, summarizes the themes and intentions of the Mass and of that liturgy. One might think, oh, surely that would be in the vernacular, because that's what you want people to more easily perhaps understand and resonate with. But no, that was retained in the Latin. And the ordinary parts of the Mass, where everybody joined in, like the Gloria and the Creed, they were in Latin. But anyway, that was the 65 edition. And then, of course, the end of 1970 came the Novus Ordo of Paul VI, the new rite or order of Mass. And that, of course, is more or less generally what one gets in the institutional church today. But under Benedict XVI, I think it was in 2007, in his motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, he gave widespread permission for Roman Catholic priests to be able to offer the traditional rite of Mass according to the 1962 edition of the Missal. So this is that which contained slight modifications that John the 23rd added, and which of course contained those more considerable modifications that Pius XII had made. Now, interestingly, in his decree, in the motu proprio, Benedict XVI states that the older form of Mass, the more traditional rite of Mass, was never abrogated. He says legally it was never abrogated. In other words, that since 1970, if Catholic priests had wanted to, they could all the time have offered the old Mass. Now, of course, this doesn't quite chime with the culture that persisted concerning the new Missal, because people, of course, will know that of the what was called affectionately the Agatha Christie indult, because Agatha Christie and various other notable Catholics in England, for example, petitioned the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Heenan, to petition Rome to get permission for the Old Mass to be offered in various places. Now, this was given what was called an indult, and so afterwards became known as indult masses. And for this, a priest would have to apply to the diocesan chancery. He would have to ask his bishop if he could have an indult and then have permission to offer the older Mass. But apparently, and according to Pope Benedict, the older Mass was never officially abrogated, meaning it was never officially said that you could never say it or you couldn't say it. But of course, as I say, that doesn't quite chime with the notion of the indult masses. Why then was permission needed for an indult mass? Anyway, the point is, with Summorum Pontificum, Benedict took away the necessity of applying for any permissions, making it that any Catholic priest could offer Mass in the traditional rite whenever he wanted to. Now, that's been taken to refer particularly to his private Masses. So a Catholic priest could say Mass privately in the older form anytime. And then with regard to perhaps parochial Masses, the suggestion was that again, wherever a cult of people, so wherever there was a group of people who expressly desired to hear Mass in the older form, their request should not be denied. Now, again, some of us will recall that various diocesan chanceries and bishops started issuing pastoral letters and directives to people, putting restrictions on what the Holy Father had just suddenly made freely available, suggesting that bishops would say, for example, in pastoral letters to their clergy, you can only say the older form of Mass if you are competent enough in Latin, and we will provide a test and a way of you proving your competency in order to be able to offer Mass, etc., etc. So there was, still, despite Benedict's clear desire to make the older Mass more widely available, still those of the Novus Ordo culture were intent on making things difficult. Now, I only mention all of that because it is the typical editio, the various editions of the Roman Missals, that the differences between the traditional Roman Catholic groups are become apparent. So that, for example, as I say, those traditional Roman Catholics in the institutional church ordinarily must use the 1962 edition of the Roman Missal. The Society of St. Pius X, who of course technically are not exactly within the institutional church, they, however, also use the 1962 Missal. This was a decision that Archbishop Lefebvre took himself, not without, it has to be said, some controversy within the society during the 70s and early 80s, when there was an ongoing debate, as it were, between which edition of the Missal they should use. Should they use the 62 Missal, which many, of course, considered to be the beginning of the end for the traditional rite, because it was the Missal at the beginning of the council that by the end of the council was on its way out. And then there were those who said, surely we should use the previous edition to that of the Missal. Surely we should use the Missal promulgated by Pius XII. And thus, avoiding, sidestepping the changes and modifications, especially to the rubrics that came in under John the 23rd with the 62 Missal. Eventually, there was a split in the society, and in Britain we have used to have a series of children's stories called the Famous Five. While the Society of St. Pius X in the early 80s had the famous Nine, and the Nine were 9 priests of the society who felt that they ought to use the right decision would be to use the Pius XII typical edition. And they fell out then with Archbishop Lefebvre. They couldn't accept his decision, and so they left and formed the Society of St. Pius V. Now, the Society of St. Pius V is a Sedevacantist congregation of clergy. And we explained the difference about Sedevacantism last week. But they use the edition, officially the 1955, I suppose, edition under Pius XII. However, that said, I won't spoil that just yet. So you have the Society of St. Pius X and those in the institutional church using the 62 Missal, and then you have then you have the Sedevacantists with Society of St. Pius V, as it were, leading the way, using the Pius XII edition. So where do we Old Romans fit in that schema of things? Well, the Old Romans invariably use the edition prior to Pius X. Prior to Pius X. Now, so John the 23rd was the Pope in the early 60s after the death of Pius XII in 1958. Pius X, of course, was Pope at the beginning of the 20th century. But as I said last week, he it was who was the first who began to introduce liturgical changes and modifications and novelties, etc., to the Roman Rite. Now, as it happens, he issued a decree with his changes and things in 1910 called Divino Afflatu. And prior to that, however, Archbishop Matthew, he, an old Roman bishop, had published a missal and ritual in the vernacular in English, which was a direct translation from the 1884, I think, typical edition of the Roman Missal. So of the Missal that was extant at the end of the 19th century. And indeed, as we said last week, that Missal itself was not really substantially different from the last typical edition before that, which was in the 1600s. All that happened in the 1884 edition was those saints who had been canonized in the intervening years had been inserted with their propers into the Missal. So Old Romans use, generally, that is to say, those who maintain the authentic tradition of Old Romanism use the oldest version of the Missal between all the groups of traditional Catholics. Now, I said earlier that I wasn't going to spoil something, which of course was to mention that one of the widely appreciated or recognized among traditional Catholics as the most heinous thing that Pius XII did to the traditional Latin liturgy was the butchering and altering of the Holy Week rites and liturgies. This he did and published in 1955. Now, as I say, common to all of those traditional groups is a general appreciation, a shared appreciation that Pius XII did, in fact, do an awful thing. And so many of them, even though technically they should, some of them only be using the 1962 Missal, a great many of them, in fact, for Holy Week, will revert to the 1955 rites and ceremonies of Holy Week. And that's so that's a place of commonality, we might say, between all the traditional groups, even those in the institutional church who are traditional Catholics generally appreciate and prefer the pre-55 Holy Week rites and liturgies. Perhaps on another occasion we might talk about those changes, but meanwhile, if you can't wait till then, I can strongly recommend discovering the New Liturgical Movement. It's called the New Liturgical Movement, which is a website stroke blog dedicated to understanding the liturgy and the beauty of the traditional Roman Rite. And there are some excellent articles there by the author Gregory de oh gosh, suddenly I've lost Gregory de no, it's gone. Gregory de Popo, I think. Gregory de Popo. Anyway, there's a search function on New Liturgical Movement, and if you search there for pre-55 Holy Week, a whole host of articles will appear. And Gregory has done a wonderful job of comparing and contrasting the differences between the original rites and ceremonies of Holy Week as they were before and then with the changes that Pius XII introduced. And it won't take a few minutes reading to realize quite how different they are. But anyway, as we've spoken about before, of course, the irony of the 20th century popes that many hold up as paragons of traditionalism were in fact themselves harbingers, we might say, of the tragedy that would later become the Novus Ordo, because they themselves had taken it upon themselves to act unilaterally and disastrously with the liturgy, tinkering about with this, that, and everything else, and allowing then this ferment of change. And again, I will just reiterate that, of course, one of our mottos as Old Romans is the sage maxim, lex orandi, lex credendi. The way we pray denotes what we believe. And when you start mucking about with the liturgy, when you start mucking about with the prayers, when you start mucking about with the shape and the form of the liturgy, you begin, if you're not careful, to very subtly and maybe even unconsciously alter the spirit and the charism and the general feeling of the liturgy, and even perhaps its intentions, which, of course, as we touched upon last week somewhat, re the liturgical rites for ordinations, when you start mucking about with those, then you really are getting into dangerous territory. For example, the 1968 rite of episcopal consecration, part of the Novus Ordo corpus of liturgical forms. Many traditional Catholics have very serious problems about that pontifical, with literally very serious concerns that doubt the efficacy of it. In other words, not quite sure that it really does make bishops, in part because the intention is not explicit, and particularly in what are considered to be the formula, the words of the formula, that is the words that really must be said in order to effect the sacrament. They have ambiguous phrases and derive from ambiguous sources, we might say. And of course, the problem with that then means that if you are doubtful about whether or not bishops are in fact bishops, and then they are ordaining priests, then you can't actually be certain that those priests are priests, and then you know, reductio absurdum, because then of course that means that other sacraments may be invalid too. And as outrageous as some people would like to think or suggest that such a notion might be, let me just point out the two incidences that have been greatly publicized in the past month alone, or maybe 6 weeks, shall we say, of two priests who, it transpired, had never been validly baptized and therefore were not validly ordained. And how did this come about? This came about through ill-formed permanent deacons who, rather than sticking with the formula given for the rite of baptism, substituted the word I for we. And because they baptized those two boys, we baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Of course, they had in fact not baptized them at all. They had changed the formula. And again, this it's not just about, of course, the formula. It's not just about the words. They, of course, are very important and they matter, but also too is the whole context of the liturgy. Part of the argument that Leo XIII was making in Apostolicae Curae, which was his denouncement and his declaration of Anglican orders as being completely null and void, part of his argument was that irrespective of any words or any formula, the context of the liturgy, the contextual aspect of the liturgy, did not itself convey nor seemingly make clear what the purpose even of the liturgy was. In other words, he was saying that the order of service, the form of service given in the Edwardine ordinal, that means the order of service for the ordering of deacons, priests, and bishops, given in the Book of Common Prayer. Leo XIII's argument was that that liturgy was not clear in and of itself, exactly as to its purpose, and likewise contextually, the liturgy itself, the way in which the ceremonies took place or didn't take place, again, provided doubt. In other words, again, lex orandi, lex credendi, Leo XIII was saying that, you know, when the church ordains or a priest or consecrates a bishop, everything about the liturgy, everything about the ceremony should explicitly manifest what the intention of the church and of the bishop and of the ministers is in what they are doing. And of course, anyone can compare and contrast the Edwardine ordinal from the Book of Common Prayer and the rites and ceremonies of ordination and consecration in the Pontificale Romanum, and you will see straight away considerable differences. Not if only in comparing the length of service, let alone the vesture, let alone the context of Mass or Holy Communion, etc., so on and so forth. And of course, this is the thing, is that we know that there was wide variance within, for example, the Church of England before the Tractarian movement. There was wide variance within the Church of England as to how various bishops performed ceremonies. It was not unusual, not uncommon, for example, for men to be ordained in the bishop's private chapel, and not necessarily for that to have been conducted within the context of a Holy Communion service, let alone within the context of an office like Matins or Evensong, Lauds or Vespers. But literally just a case of said clergyman walking in, kneeling before the bishop, before his altar, no particular vestments being worn at all, just their day street wear. The bishop laying his hands and saying, "Receive ye the Holy Ghost for the office of deacon or the office of priest," etc. In the Church of God, and that was deemed for that chap to have been ordained. And you can see why Leo the 13th is concerned, because he's thinking, hold on a minute, how can that possibly convey what we in the Catholic Church? How can that compare? And if any of you have seen or witnessed an ordination or a consecration in the traditional Roman liturgy, you will know it is a very long, complicated service, that it always takes place in the context of a pontifical mass. Indeed, that the newly ordained priest or the newly consecrated bishop concelebrates with the ordaining or consecrating bishop. The only time in the traditional rite when concelebration occurs. And so, and various other aspects, etc. And of course, the vestments, the production of instruments. So, for example, of course, when a priest is ordained in the traditional rite, he is presented by the ordaining bishop to touch, after his hands have been anointed and consecrated with the oil. He is then presented the chalice and the paten, with wine and water in it, and the host upon the paten, and he's touched that, and all this to signify that, of course, his hands have been consecrated, and he has been made a priest specifically in order to be able to offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Likewise, some of you will, I'm sure, remember that at the beginning of the rite of ordination of a priest in the traditional rite, the back of the chasuble is folded up. Rather than hanging down, it's folded up. And only until after Holy Communion, when the bishop returns back to the fold stool, is the new priest then given the blessing and the permission to be able to hear and to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation, of penance. So, again, and obviously none of that, there's no equivalent of that given in the Edwardine Book of Common Prayer Ordinal. Now, there are, of course, many who have, said, I mean, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York actually wrote back to Leo the 13th in a document called Sapius Officio, which many classical scholars of Latin will tell you is a much better version, a much better Latin document and prose than that which Rome had issued in Apostolicae Curae. But that aside, they make various arguments there, which, have, of course, are worth hearing. But I think in many ways don't really answer the complete charge and the complete case that Leo the 13th is making in his own letter. And so subsequently, as many will know, the Anglicans then went into intercommunion with the Old Catholics at Utrecht in 1931. And in that intercommunion, an agreement was that an Old Catholic bishop would periodically attend the consecration of new Church of England bishops and participate in those consecrations. Now, what used to happen was that the Book of Common Prayer, the Edwardine Ordinal, would be used, and that involved the Anglican bishops wearing choir dress, essentially, rochet and shimmer, and scarf and hood. And this wouldn't take necessarily place in the context of a Eucharist, and the Anglicans would do what the Book of Common Prayer told them to do, and then they would do their what's sometimes called the Holy Huddle, so that the candidate is kneeling in front of the president of the consecration, and all the other bishops around stand around and come close, and at the moment of consecration they all reach out and put their hands on the candidate. When the Dutch bishops participated, then apparently those Anglican bishops would step back, and then the Dutch bishop would come forward, the Old Catholic bishop would come forward, lay his hands on the candidate's head and recite what was deemed to be the formula, so the necessary requisite words from the Pontificale to consecrate a bishop. Now, of course, there's been, great discussions ever since as to the efficacy or not of all of that, which is invariably popularly termed now as the Dutch touch. And so, but the issue, of course, again, is that Leo XIII's stipulations in Apostolicae Curae, again, the liturgical context is missing. The liturgical context is missing. Indeed, in the Latin Rite, it is although variously people will say, of course, sacramental theologians, etc., have stipulated which of the words are the necessary words, the words that are said to effect the sacrament. Nobody has ever suggested that they necessarily work outside the context of the whole liturgy, of the whole prescribed liturgy. In other words, the notion that you could confect a sacrament with the barest, as it were, means, so with the form, with the matter, and with the intention alone, in other words, without all the ceremony and everything else, that's never been asserted within the Latin Rite as ever being a thing. Indeed, somebody only recently showed a video from Maynooth from the 50s, I think, where the Archbishop was ordaining something like 50 priests. And although he wasn't celebrating a pontifical high mass, nonetheless, the ordinations took place within the context of a pontifical low mass. And all the requisite actions and so on and so forth, all the rubrics were all still applied. So even though it wasn't a grander ceremony like a pontifical high mass would otherwise be, nonetheless, as it were, everything was still there that would need to be there and should be there. So the liturgical context was safe, was secure. So you can't say that he was doing it outside of the liturgical context. And as you said before, that the liturgical context is important because the liturgy itself conveys, frames the intention of everything that's going on, of what's being done. So that's and then I suppose so. And I'm sorry, I've sort of digressed. But a question that very often people ask is about the validity of Anglican orders. To which I can only say that I was privileged some years ago to have attended a very important meeting of Anglo-Catholic clergy with the then Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, Basil Hume, who were, they themselves, of course, the Anglican clergy, were considering converting or being received into the Roman Church. This was immediately following the General Synod decision to ordain women as priests in November 1992. This happened a few months after that. And Basil Hume gave an anecdote about a very close personal friend of his, happened to be a blind Anglican priest. And he said that they used to go on holidays together. And wherever they would go, they would say their private masses. But of course, they would say their own private masses. And one day, this very good friend of Cardinal Hume's, Hume turned to him and asked, Basil, we say our own private masses, we understand the whole, the official situation, etc. We're not in communion, so on and so forth. But he said, on a personal level, on a spiritual level, can I ask, do you consider my orders and thus my sacraments and that's my mass? Do you personally, do you consider that they are valid? And bear in mind, of course, that they were very good friends. So discussing the priestly life and priestly spirituality and the joys and the ups and downs of pastoral and parochial ministry, etc., they would have shared numerous times. And Basil Hume related this story before there were at least 100, I think, Anglo-Catholic priests gathered there. And he said, and I can only tell you what I said to David, I think his friend's name was. And the only sincere answer I can give is, I don't know. I don't know. Now, of course, as I said the other week, this is essentially the same answer that traditionalists would give concerning Novus Ordo ordinations and consecrations and sacraments, and likewise about Anglican ordinations and consecrations. As Bishop Tissier de Malray, one of the SSPX bishops, one of the Society of St. Pius X bishops, quite rightly pointed out, none of us have the competency, authority to make declarations necessarily about the validity of others' sacraments. However, we do know that a sound Catholic principle and a very important principle of sacramental theology is that though God is not limited to the sacraments to convey his grace, he is indeed bound to them. Thus, one should not have uncertainty or doubt about sacraments. But conversely, of course, then when there is doubt, one really should avoid them. Now, many people will say, and of course, Bishop Tissier's former colleague, Bishop Richard Williamson, he would say, as he has said, that he believes that Novus Ordo sacraments may be valid because of, for example, the phenomena of Eucharistic miracles. Even in recent years, there have been Eucharistic miracles of hosts consecrated by Novus Ordo priests offering the Novus Ordo Mass. And Richard Williamson, Bishop Williamson says, so maybe that's evidence, maybe that's suggestion that those rites can still are sacramentally effective. But the exception, of course, doesn't really necessarily prove the rule. And so most traditional Catholics would err on the side of caution and say, and ultimately say, well, why worry about doubtful sacraments when we know where valid sacraments are? And that is why generally Anglican or Novus Ordo, for want of a better word, converts are received into tradition. Generally, they receive what's called sub conditione, some conditional ordination. Sometimes some conditional confirmation, and perhaps occasionally now we may have to check the status of baptism. I think we said on Old Romans Unscripted a couple of weeks back on this same subject that it used to be that one could take it for granted that most Christian churches baptized in the Trinitarian formula. But of course, in the last 50 years, it's not only Rome that has seemingly lost its head and certainly lost any uniformity in the celebration of liturgies, but other liturgical denominations have as well, so that you can't perhaps be as sure as you once were exactly what rite and how such rite was celebrated for any given person. I mean, in the sense that, for example, probably somebody baptized by an Oratorian priest at the Brompton Oratory or the Birmingham Oratory, one can pretty much, one would be fairly certain that said priest would have done everything according to the book. But you couldn't necessarily say that about old Father so-and-so in St. Watsit's parish, who, you know, invariably, who gave up wearing chasubles to say Mass 30 years ago, who doesn't observe the rubrics in saying Mass, etc., etc. You can't rely. And then, of course, the two incidents that occurred recently, and remember that those baptisms were over 30 years ago, of those priests that subsequently weren't priests, but now, of course, been remade priests. But the invalidity, those invalid baptisms that occurred 30 years ago. Now, who knows how many other baptisms were improperly celebrated and administered, and who knows how many other rites of the church likewise have not been properly celebrated and rubrics adhered to. Most, I'm sure, liturgists, though those who have an interest in liturgy, can tell whether or not a priest is in fact offering Mass according to the rubrics, whether that's of the old Mass or of the new Mass, because surprise, surprise to some people, the new Mass still has rubrics. There is still supposed to be a way of how things are supposed to be done. It's called the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. Father, it's that little bit in the front of the sacramentary, the rubrics, the general norms, etc. But there are many, of course, who eschew all that, don't bother with all that. And as I said earlier, of course, and as Leo XIII was pointing out in Apostolicae Curae, when you start, when you have that sort of ambiguity about things, if you start mucking about with things, or you stop doing this, that, or whatever, or if it all becomes whim and fancy, you know, I mean, we've all seen, I know, I'm sure you have, I know I have many times seen priests in the institutional church, almost no two priests say Mass the same way, even in the same parish. Indeed, of course, it's now, you know, normal for many people to express a preference as to which mass they attend, as to which priest says it. And invariably, when you hear them, when you listen to them, often what they say, read the difference, will come down to the observance or not of particular rubrics. Aside from the showman-like charisma that celebrants need to celebrate the Novus Ordo, because they're constantly facing the congregation, etc. And that may sound like a suspicious or cynical thing to say, except that we've all heard members of the faithful say, "Oh, I don't like it when Father so and so says mass. I don't like his voice." Or I don't like it when Father so and so says mass. I don't like his face. I don't like the expressions he puts on, etc. We've all heard that. In stark contrast, of course, to the traditional liturgy, where most of the time the priest's face is turned toward God rather than to the people, and so the personality, as it were, the particular individual charisma of the celebrant doesn't come into it, and especially because in the traditional rite, priests observe all the rubrics, and they are uniform. This is the always the interesting thing. Sometimes in the so-called independent sacramental movement of the Episcopavigantes crowd, often some of them, one of them will say, I know how to say the traditional mass, and then you watch them and they haven't got a clue. You can tell if someone's been formed and trained to offer the traditional rite or not, because the rubrics are standardized and uniform. There is very little, except in the kind of circumstantial physical environment that might require a slight modification of some action, of some ritual action or gesture or movement, literally depending on the furniture of the building or whatever. But even then, of course, prior to Vatican II, Catholic churches and chapels were pretty much standardized and uniform in their arrangement all over the world. The high altar or the altar was always at the east end, or at least the liturgical east end, and the ambo or the lectern would be outside the sanctuary, etc. It's only in recent years, well, at least the last 50 years since the end of the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, you're never quite sure what you're going to find when you walk into a Catholic church now. Sometimes the font is next to the altar. Sometimes the priest's chair is in an exalted position in what our Eastern Orthodox would generally recognize as the high place. In other words, where the bishop ought to sit behind the altar, but it's not unusual for many priests using the new mass to situate themselves there, or for the ordering of their sanctuaries to be arranged in such a way, etc. It's you just never know what you're going to get these days, and of course that is, again, fundamentally part of the problem. Read the liturgy, and also, of course, doctrinally now. Again, you see, lex orandi, lex credendi. Well, now that prayer is itself not uniform, now that liturgy itself is not uniform, now that the context of the liturgy is no longer uniform. The intentions, the significations, the understanding, the doctrine is all, it's all a free-for-all now. I mean, bless them. I won't mention any names. I don't want to embarrass anyone, but somebody recently said that they had become a Catholic and they were now an altar server. I think expecting me to be effusive with praise, except of course that the individual concerned, they're very nice and otherwise, lovely person, but is a woman. Now, even John Paul II forbade girl and women altar servers, and in fact, it was about girl servers. This lady, bless her, is we couldn't call her a girl anymore. Nobody would call her a girl. I couldn't answer, I'm afraid. Didn't know what to say. Less said, soonest mended. Or as somebody else says, if you haven't got anything nice to say, then don't say anything at all. So I didn't say anything at all. Because, of course, all of the context of what she was talking about was the antithesis of tradition. It's, this is the problem today. Is there is just no uniformity within even the institutional church as to how the liturgy is celebrated. So, of course, now some people might say, oh, well, but you traditionalists are fine ones to talk when some of you are using the 62, some of you are using the 55, some of you are using the pre-55s, some of you are using the 1910, some of you are using older editions. You lot are no better in terms of uniformity, except to say that actually all the prayers, all the lections, all the readings, all the feasts, all the rest of it are pretty much the same across the board, even with those later editions of the Missal. Yes, some changes, and not insignificant changes, were made in the later editions, but the whole rite itself, and more or less the rubrics and how they work, all of that was pretty much the same. So there is, despite some doctrinals, despite some liturgical differences or distinctions between traditionalist Catholic groups, on the whole, and of course this is sometimes a problem, on the whole, we look and sound very much alike. But it is only, as it were, in the finer points or the nuances that differences and distinctions become apparent. But somebody walking into an Old Roman chapel during Mass, or an SSPX chapel during Mass, or a Sedevacantists chapel during Mass, on the whole, they would not know that there was a difference between the way those priests were saying and offering Mass. As far as anyone who doesn't know, they wouldn't know really, or really spot any differences. The only difference being probably Holy Week, because then there would be considerable differences between the 62ers and the 55s and the pre-55s. Yeah, so gosh, that's quite a lot I've spoken about there, and haven't really got onto the meat and the substance of what I originally intended to talk about. But that's fine, because I can save that and use that another time. Yeah. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening, and do feel free to contact me if you have any questions. If you want any clarification, I'm more than happy, of course, to answer questions within the context of conferences. So, and if you don't want to be named, that's fine. I don't have to name you. I can rephrase the question, rather like I do for late night catechism. It can be anonymous, but it's good indeed to receive questions, because it does allow me to think and frame these conferences in such a way as to answer those points, and to perhaps at the same time provide the information that will answer any subsequent questions. So by all means, do feel free to contact me. If there's anything I've said in this talk or all the previous videos that you'd like clarification on, then please don't hesitate. So all that remains for me now then is to again thank you for watching. I will just draw your attention once more and invite you, if you have enjoyed this talk, then and generally appreciate the schedule of programs that we produce on Old Roman TV, then please consider becoming a patron, if only for a small regular donation, but everything will be helpful. And as I said earlier, you can receive some merch. Indeed, you can, when you sign up as a patron, here is the Patreon page, and you will be given options there, such that these levels, which of course are the traditional levels of progression in ordination in the Latin Rite, these denote the different levels of subscription that you can sign up for. And there are various benefits attached to those different levels of subscription, which include, as I said before, things like this wonderful mug. Likewise, a logoed t-shirt. And I think this really is a must-have, is the logoed hoodie. So of your charity, please do consider expressing your appreciation for what we do by helping us and supporting us to enable us to keep on doing what we're doing. Next broadcast, of course, will be Mass tomorrow at 8:30. Tomorrow, of course, is the feast of St. Michael of St. Michael the Archangel. I almost gave the modernist title then. The feast of the dedication of St. Michael, which of course is the commemoration of a church which sadly no longer exists, but once existed in Rome, that was dedicated to the patronage of the Archangel. But nonetheless, in the Universal Church, we still recall and we give thanks for his patronage. If you didn't see Old Romans Unscripted last Saturday, then go to Old Roman TV and you can find the link. If you go to facebook.com/the Old Roman, you can find there live videos page, and all the broadcasts that have preceded this you can find there. So find Old Romans Unscripted. It's episode 27, because in it we discuss Michaelmas. We discuss St. Michael's Day and the various customs, etc., associated with it. So if you haven't seen that already, please go there and enjoy that episode. Otherwise, the Angelus, of course, tomorrow, and at 6 o'clock, the Rosary. And I do encourage as many people as are able at that time of day, at about 6 p.m, as it is here in the UK. We online share recitation of the Holy Rosary. We do it in the traditional form with the traditional mysteries, and we recite it bilingually in Latin and English. And we share our intentions, so our prayer intentions. So if you would appreciate others to pray for any particular intention of your own, or for a loved one, or a friend or colleague, or a particular situation, then please know that at 6 p.m. We are, after the Angelus, reciting the Rosary, and more than happy to pray for your intentions. And of course, the more that join us, the more the merrier. So that's from 6 o'clock tomorrow. Then on Wednesday, of course, Mass again at 8:30, Holy Hour at 6 p.m, again with recitation of the Rosary, exposition of the Sacrament and benediction, and at 9 p.m, late night catechism. So I hope to see you all at all of those, or any one of those. And the meanwhile, please consider supporting our work. And otherwise, God bless you, and thank you for watching.